Okay, students, so this was the last two questions on the formal assessment 5. The first question you could have chose was this evaluate question. Evaluate the likely microeconomic and macroeconomic. Just underline that because that's really important. We need at least probably a micro and a macroeconomic graph to help us to structure this. Effects of the imposition of price controls. And price controls is a micro topic in Argentina. As it's an evaluate question, we're going to need two sides. So we're going to need some positive effects and some negative effects. And also we're going to need an evaluative conclusion, which is going to show judgment. Okay. So if we just have a quick look at the relevant parts of the case study. So it mentions that Argentinians eat 64 kilos of beef a year, which is kind of a significant amount in terms of their consumption, their standard of living. It's obviously a necessity for many of them. And it talks about the effects of the government intervention and an unfavourable macroeconomic environment. So we know that there's other negatives in the economy going on. It says the government has recently sought to reduce the rate of inflation through price controls. So the two price controls that we have looked at, or you should have looked at last year, was a maximum price and a minimum price. In this case, it's going to be a maximum price. It's going to be a price ceiling to keep the price below this to help to reduce inflation. So inflation is telling you the price of beef's rising. This is going to try to keep the price of beef down. It also gives another figure here of a specific, so a 30% jump in beef prices. But it also talks more widely about a number of necessities. So 200 supermarket items is implying that it's necessities, which is going to do that with. It again talks a little bit about why price controls are effective, because there is, as a form of regulation or a legally binding thing, there are fines, but also closing businesses to make sure that businesses follow the price controls. So on one side we need to talk about why it would be effective. So we need the maximum price graph. So supply and demand, we set the maximum price. It's going to give us three equilibriums. So we have an equilibrium which would have been the free market equilibrium, but then we also have this equilibrium which is linked to demand, and this equilibrium which is linked to supply. Now, in terms of analysing this, we want reasons why it works and why it doesn't work. Now, as this is a micro graph, we are going to have a discussion here, but it's going to be solely focused on micro. So we'll come back to what the macro part of this could be in a second. What you do have, if you just look at it from one side, is in theory, consumers will be able to consume at Q1 and P1, so the price will fall, and in theory the quantity demanded will rise. However, and so you need to talk about this from kind of the positive side to start with. In theory, if that was the case, you would have a whole lot of extra consumer surplus there, which benefits in terms of standard of living. So if it was to work, consumer surplus would rise, consumer standard of living would rise, and this would bring down inflation throughout the economy. There'd be lower wage demands and so on. However, and this is the negative, what you would actually get in terms of supply is that some businesses would not be able to supply for that price. So this quantity here would be linked to the number of businesses whose cost of production is too high, and therefore there is going to be a shortage of supply between these two quantities. And what that is that the number, and we'll just kind of use this as an example, so the number of people wanting cheap beef is 100, there used to only be 75, but only 50 people can actually get that price. So you've got a number, you've got 50 as the number of people who are willing and in theory able to buy beef, but a lack of supply, a quantity Q2, and that's why they cannot get access to it. So that's the kind of the other part of it, that businesses whose cost of production is higher can't afford, so they make a loss, and this means that supply reduces to Q2. Okay, if you to evaluate that as a point itself, what you do have then is a government failure, because you have a misallocation of resources. You have people looking for beef at a cheap price who can't find it, so that there's people in this market that shouldn't be here. There could be another market finding other food, but they think there's cheap beef out there, or they think there's another cheap good or service that's available for them. The last little part in terms of depth or detail that you could get from this example is that in reality there isn't an increase in consumer surplus, because it's at that quantity. Okay, the consumer surplus would be that part there. So the current consumers benefit more greatly. So there's 50 people that benefit more, but there's 25 people that have lost out. So there is a loss in consumer surplus in that little triangle there. But also there is a loss of producer surplus in there, some of which is reallocated to the consumers, but then what you do have is a deadweight loss of that producer surplus there. So this triangle that I'm kind of drawing in light blue is the deadweight loss. There's a loss to consumers and there's a loss to producers. So some consumers who could afford, who used to be able to buy it, can't get it because it's not available, and some producers that used to produce it can't produce it because the cost is too high. But that last little bit is real high level stuff. So if you don't have the time to do that, just stick with what you've got there. The last part is kind of, one part is the macro part of this. So the macro part, if you link it into the negatives, what you will have is the shortage, which is due to businesses going out of business. Or you can also have, because the minimum price can reduce the numbers of farmers, so the farmers can kind of not provide their cattle to markets. So the supermarkets themselves might go out of business, especially if they start getting fined, but the farmers themselves might not do that. Now what that might cause on a macro scale is cost plus inflation, and that's what it did do to Argentina. So there's less quantity available of factors of production due to businesses going out of business, but there's also, in terms of short run aggregate supply, there's less supply available in the economy as people hold on to the finished products. So you end up with a higher inflation across the economy. Now that then becomes a wider context thing. So what you have is the costs outweighing the benefits of that policy, because the only people that benefit are the people who can still buy beef. So the smaller number of people who can still buy beef at the lower price are the only ones that benefit. The people that lose out are some businesses, some consumers in that market, but also you have negative externalities in other markets. You've got people that are going to end up suffering from inflation in the wider economy that don't buy beef, because this could lead to a price wage spiral. So businesses go out of business, the price of other goods will start going up, and then this could cause further wage demands to try and afford. Also, if you did have time, you could talk about in terms of another reason why it might not work is that you start also getting kind of black markets. So farmers start selling their beef outside of the market to achieve a higher price, and that will tend to be at an even higher price than it was originally. Okay, the next question that you looked at, or you could have chose, was evaluate the likely microeconomic and macroeconomic. Again, so we need to have something from both sides, a graph from both effects of a devaluation. It tells you 23% devaluation of the Argentinian peso. That is a significant devaluation. So we might want to come back to that as a scale thing to evaluate. The relevant stuff from the case study talks about that it's not the only measure that is used, but it is the purpose to reduce capital flight. It's also to prevent a rapid decline in foreign reserves and avoid a balance of payments crisis. Okay, now there'll be several reasons for this, and we'll kind of come back to them in a second. As the question is kind of looking at effects, it's going to be looking at kind of positive and negative effects, but there's also a wider context here. So even though there's a suggestion here of what the target is, it also mentions here that that there is also a need to tighten monetary policy. So one of the ways in which you can devalue your currency is to loosen monetary policy, so reduce interest rates. But then this mentions that they may need to tighten monetary policy, increase interest rates to control inflation. So it's automatically kind of giving you something that might be a negative there. And it does mention that it's over 25%. There was a previous question about this, so be careful not to turn this into an inflation question, but it is a wider context thing. And it does say many economists fear that the devaluation could fuel inflation further. Further problems include relatively low commodity prices, which are reducing the balance of trade surplus. So low commodity prices could link into the pre-British Singer hypothesis, because you've got something there that links into trade, and especially trade, which is their main exports. And it goes on to tell you that agricultural production, so commodities, including beef and soya, are almost half of Argentinia's exports. So they in themselves are the single most important source of foreign exchange. So looking at that in terms of the positive effect, so initially what you want to look at is why they would do that. Now there's linking it into that capital flight argument if you have time, but the most obvious one is just the effect on the trade balance. And also when it says foreign reserves, and it does also talk about the balance of payments. So the initial one is that you're effectively going to have, I know it's weak peso, imports dear, exports cheap. You want to include the word relative in there, so they become relatively cheaper, because it's not just the cheapness, it's the cheapness against other countries' exports. Then the value of exports would rise. There would be a switch to domestic production or domestic firms as the imports become relatively more expensive, so the value of imports will fall. Then either a reduction in the trade deficit, or you would see an improving trade balance, or potentially in the long term a trade surplus. Okay, so that can then link into, because you've got a link to the balance of payments, by exporting more, people will pay for those goods with other currencies, so you manage to get more foreign reserves, so an increase in dollars or pounds or whatever it is, and that then allows you to buy imports. So that's the kind of effect in terms of that. In terms of the capital flight, what you're hoping is that this will give a boost to the economy. And again, this is kind of how you could analyse the wider impacts of this is that net trade X minus M, or net exports, will rise. That'll increase aggregate demand, and you'll get an increase in real GDP, potential increase in the price level. Although you could also argue from another point of view that I'll come to in a second. But one of the key benefits of that, the economic growth, is that capital may stay in the economy. So if it does help the economy to grow, you might stay in the economy. Now, the negative of this, which is kind of part of the why not, would be the inflation, and inflation from two things. So there is already 25% inflation, and we just drew that graph showing demand pull. But also Argentina will have a significant amount of imports, and probably inelastic imports. So either the short run aggregate supply graph, with a fall in short run aggregate supply, or a cost push inflation graph as well. So the higher price level, just to analyse what the negative is. So now don't necessarily turn this into an essay about the negatives of inflation, because you've already done that. You just want to take this to that it could lead to inflation within the economy. We'd then still need something micro. So if you stick with this negative of inflation, there's a few things you could do. You could do a very simple supply and demand graph and talk about this because the cost of production for businesses has risen, especially if they import raw materials. Then to take this in a little bit more detail, you could reduce consumer surplus within the economy. So you could talk about it in the market for an imported good like oil, and say that the price of petrol and diesel is going to rise for consumers, and then the quantity could fall. An even better way, which would give you probably higher analysis marks, would be to look at the impact on a business. And what you could do here is raise the cost of production, so the average cost and the marginal cost rises. And in this, the way I've just drawn that there, as I've just realised, is that if we draw that in terms of profit maximising still, it's not going to be 100% accurate. I've essentially turned that business into a loss-making business now. So average costs have risen, marginal costs have risen with them, but it's risen above the average revenue of the business, and I've created a loss. So you could do it in terms of impact on consumers, or you could do it in terms of impact to businesses by lifting up average and marginal cost. And either one of those would be a relevant way to kind of link it into a negative to the microeconomy. The last thing we want to do is to kind of evaluate this. A few ways you can evaluate it, because it's the weak exchange rate, and because one of the targets is an improving balance of payments, the best and most obvious way to do this is the J-curve. So the J-curve graph, surplus on one side, deficit on the other, positive and negative. We're assuming that Argentina's balance of payments is in deficit, which it tells us, and initially you have the worsening of the trade balance, and that is because in the short term the demand for imports and exports tends to be price inelastic. So as the price falls, the demand stays about the same, and businesses and essentially the trade balance lose revenue. So that's to do with things like fixed contracts, but also kind of the time it takes to find substitutes. And then in the longer term, those things change. The trade balance improves. So you've got the improving trade balance here. So you can use that to do an it depends upon time. Short term equals worse, long term equals better. You could then also use the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis to talk about the weaker exchange rate will make the terms of trade worse, and that could lead to a deterioration of the balance of trade over time. Or some people also did look at the Marshall-Lerner condition and use that. So those for that question tend to be the most effective ways to evaluate it.